My name is Destiny Owens, and I am 26 years old. And 3 years ago, a woman named Brooke Holloway stood in the break room at work and imitated the way I pray, hands raised, eyes closed, in front of 6 other coworkers, while I stood at the coffee machine pretending I could not hear her. 2 Sundays ago, that same woman sat in the third row of my church, River of Life, in Kansas City, Missouri, with her own hands raised for the first time in her life, crying through the entire second song. I want to tell you about the 3 years in between, because I know some of you have been mocked for exactly the kind of faith you practice, quietly or loudly, by people who share a desk with you 5 days a week, and I do not think we hear enough about how a story like that can actually end. Before I go any further, I want you to remember one small thing for me, because it comes back later and I promise I will return to it. On my very first day at Heartland Mutual Insurance, I kept a small tambourine in my desk drawer, a gift from my grandmother, not because I ever intended to use it at work, simply because it reminded me of home. Hold on to that tambourine. It matters more than you would think. If you have ever been mocked for the way you worship, this one is for you. Go ahead and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from, because I read every single one. Let me take you back to a Monday morning 3 years ago, and to the exact moment I understood what the next 3 years at that job were going to look like. I grew up in Kansas City at a small charismatic congregation called River of Life, the kind of church where the worship goes on until somebody feels released to stop, rather than until a clock says so, where people raise their hands without embarrassment, where a prayer language most people outside that world have never once heard is simply part of the ordinary furniture of a Sunday morning, and where nobody blinks if a service runs 2.5 hours because the room is not in any hurry to leave. My mother has led the women's prayer ministry there for over 15 years, and my father plays keys on the worship team most Sundays, and I was raised understanding that faith was not something you kept quiet and folded up for polite company. It was something you lived out loud, with your whole body, because you believed the God you were singing to was actually in the room. River of Life meets in a converted warehouse on the east side of the city, string lights and exposed brick, a congregation that has grown, over the 2 decades my parents have attended, from a handful of families meeting in a living room into nearly 400 people, filling 3 services every Sunday. I was baptized there at 12, received what my congregation calls the baptism of the Holy Spirit at 14, an experience I have never once been able to fully explain to anyone who has not lived through something similar themselves. And I grew up assuming, the way you assume most things about your own childhood, that the whole world understood faith roughly the way my own family did. I remember, as a girl, standing in that warehouse sanctuary between my own parents during the closing worship most Sundays, my father's keyboard filling the room from the stage, my mother's hand occasionally finding mine during a particularly moving song, and I remember thinking, even at 10 or 11, that this particular fullness of feeling was simply what church was supposed to feel like, not realizing until years later how differently other people's Sunday mornings could look, and how easily that difference could be turned into ridicule by someone who had never once experienced anything like it themselves. I did not understand, until my first year at Heartland Mutual, exactly how unusual my own upbringing actually looked from the outside, or how easily the specific vocabulary of my own faith, tongues, being slain in the spirit, prophetic words, could be turned into a punchline by people who had never once sat inside a room like the one I grew up in. I took a job in claims processing at Heartland Mutual Insurance the year after I finished my associate's degree. A steady, unremarkable job in a large open office on the edge of downtown, the kind of place with beige cubicles and a break room that always smelled faintly of burnt coffee. I did not go into that job expecting anyone to care one way or another what I did on Sunday mornings. I simply assumed, the way you assume most things at 23, that people would either be curious or indifferent, and that either reaction would be fine. The job itself suited me well enough. I am good with detail, patient with the particular tedium of reviewing claim after claim for accuracy, and I liked, that first year, the quiet satisfaction of a stack of files cleared by the end of the day, a different kind of order than the one I found on Sunday mornings, but an order nonetheless. I remember my first week clearly, the particular nervousness of learning an unfamiliar system, the relief of finally understanding how the claims queue worked, the small satisfaction of my manager telling me at the end of that first week that I had picked things up faster than most new hires. I remember thinking, driving home that Friday, that I had genuinely landed somewhere good, a thought I held on to for longer than I probably should have, given everything that was still ahead of me. Brooke Holloway was my team lead from nearly my first week there, a sharp, capable woman in her late 30s who had been with the company over a decade and who ran her small team with a kind of brisk, no-nonsense efficiency that most people, myself included at first, genuinely respected. She trained me herself those first few weeks, patient and thorough, and I remember liking her, genuinely, before I ever understood what she would eventually decide to make of my faith. I do not think Brooke set out, in those early months, to become anyone's tormentor. I think it started, the way these things often do, as something closer to curiosity that curdled, slowly, into something meaner once she decided my faith was worth making fun of rather than worth understanding. I remember, specifically, one of my first training sessions with her, sitting side by side at her desk while she walked me through the claims system, patient in a way that genuinely surprised me, given her reputation among the other new hires as someone who did not suffer mistakes gladly. She asked me, that same afternoon, almost as an aside, what I liked to do outside of work, and I told her, honestly, that most of my free time centered around my church, and she nodded, seemingly unbothered, and moved on to the next screen in the training module. I remember thinking, that particular afternoon, that we were going to get along well, and for the better part of that first year, we mostly did. It started small, the way these things always seem to. I mentioned, in an ordinary lunch conversation during my first month, that I had been at church until nearly 1 in the afternoon the previous Sunday, and a coworker named Tyler, kind enough in most ways, asked, half joking, whether that included the part where people fall down and start talking gibberish. I laughed it off, the way you do when you are new and want to be liked, and explained, briefly, what praying in tongues actually meant to those of us who practiced it. A private prayer language, not a performance, something Scripture itself describes as a gift rather than a spectacle. Tyler nodded, seemingly satisfied, and I thought, that first month, that the subject was closed. I remember that lunch clearly, sitting at a round table in the break room with 4 coworkers I barely knew yet, trying to explain, in language I hoped sounded reasonable rather than strange, an experience that had been simply ordinary to me my entire life. I remember choosing my words carefully, wanting to be understood rather than dismissed, and I remember feeling, at the time, that I had succeeded, that the table had genuinely listened rather than merely tolerated. It was not closed, the ultimate audio choice for high-end podcasts and modern digital media. It had simply gone underground, resurfacing every few weeks in a slightly sharper form, a comment here, a raised eyebrow there, until, by my second year at Heartland Mutual, it had become something closer to a running bit that Brooke, in particular, seemed to genuinely enjoy performing whenever a new hire needed entertaining. I had come in early to grab coffee before a meeting, and Brooke, not realizing I was standing just around the corner, was demonstrating for 2 newer hires, hands raised theatrically, eyes rolled back, a string of exaggerated nonsense syllables spilling out of her mouth in a mockery of the prayer language she had heard me use once, months earlier, in an offhand comment about my own devotional life. The 2 new hires laughed. I stood at the coffee machine, coffee going cold in my hand, and said nothing, because I did not yet know how to respond to something that specific and that public without making an already uncomfortable moment worse. I remember every detail of that particular Tuesday morning, the fluorescent hum of the break room lights, the specific chip in the mug I was holding, the exact pitch of the laughter that followed Brooke's performance, the kind of laughter that tells you a joke has been rehearsed and refined over multiple tellings rather than arrived at spontaneously in that moment. I walked back to my desk afterward and sat there for several minutes before I could bring myself to open my email. Hands not quite steady, replaying the scene and wondering how long this particular version of me had been circulating through the office before I ever happened to overhear it myself. I did not tell anyone about it that day. Not my mother, not my pastor, nobody at River of Life. I simply carried it home with me. The particular heaviness of learning that you have been someone's private entertainment for an unknown length of time before you ever discovered it yourself. I did not know yet that this exact scene, Brooke's careless, cruel imitation of the very prayer language she would one day ask me, in a very different room, to teach her the meaning of, was the precise moment I would think back to, 3 years later, standing beside her in a hospital hallway. I only knew, walking back to my desk that particular Tuesday morning, that something had shifted in how safe I felt at that job, a shift I would carry, quietly, for the better part of the following 3 years. The first 2 years, the mockery lived mostly in small, deniable moments rather than large, confrontational ones. Brooke started calling me the tambourine girl, first behind my back, then, gradually, to my face. A nickname that referenced nothing I had ever actually brought to work, purely a caricature she had built out of every stereotype about charismatic worship she had ever half absorbed from television or secondhand jokes. She began scheduling team lunches on days she knew I had a standing Wednesday night Bible study, never quite excluding me outright, simply arranging things so that attending consistently cost me something. I want to be specific about how the nickname actually functioned, because I think the mechanism matters. Brooke never once called me the tambourine girl in a meeting where a manager was present, never in an email that could be forwarded, always in the particular deniable space of a hallway comment or a break room aside, the kind of thing that would sound, if I ever repeated it to human resources, like I was overreacting to nothing at all. I remember the first time she used it directly to my face rather than behind my back, in the elevator, just the two of us, a casual, almost friendly tone, as though the nickname itself were a term of affection rather than a weapon. I laughed along, the way I had trained myself to by then, and rode the rest of that elevator ride in a silence I hope did not read as anything other than easy comfort with the joke, though inside I was doing the particular math you do in moments like that, calculating exactly how many more months or years I might have left of hearing it. There was a specific incident in my second year that stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that stretch, and I want to tell it to you exactly the way it happened, because it is the moment that told me plainly what those years were going to cost me. Our team had a monthly gathering to celebrate birthdays, and at mine, Brooke stood to lead the small ritual of everyone saying something kind, the way she always did, and said, smiling, that she was grateful for my enthusiasm, that some of us clearly felt things a little more intensely than others, and let the sentence sit there a beat too long before moving on to the cake. The room laughed. The particular laugh that happens when everyone has decided a joke is safe, simply because nobody has objected yet. I laughed too, because that is what you do when you are 24 years old and desperately do not want to become the coworker who cannot take a joke. I drove home that evening and sat in my car outside my own apartment for nearly 10 minutes before going inside, replaying the exact wording of that toast, trying to decide whether I was overreacting to something genuinely innocent or correctly identifying something genuinely cruel, dressed up as affection. I did not have a clear answer that particular night. I have a much clearer one now. I did not know yet that this same careful, public sentence, dressed up as an ordinary birthday toast, was the exact moment I would remember 3 years later, sitting in a waiting room with the same woman's hand shaking in mine. I only knew, driving home that particular evening, that the accumulation of these small moments had begun to feel less like isolated incidents and more like the actual shape of my daily working life. The following 2 years settled into a pattern I came to recognize with a kind of exhausted familiarity. Tyler and a woman named Courtney, who had started around the same time as me, followed Brooke's lead, the way people often follow the lead of whoever seems to be enjoying themselves most in a room, not out of any particular personal cruelty of their own, simply out of the ordinary human instinct to stay inside the group rather than risk becoming its next target. I want to be fair to both of them here, because it would be easy to flatten them into simple villains, and neither one of them was ever quite that, not across the whole span of this story. Tyler, in particular, seemed uncomfortable more than once with where a joke had gone, and I remember catching him, on at least 2 occasions, changing the subject himself when Brooke's mockery started drifting towards something crueler than she perhaps intended. Courtney, quieter than either of the other two, mostly laughed along rather than initiating anything herself, and I have come to believe, looking back, that she was simply relieved, most days, that the mockery had settled on someone other than her. Courtney told me herself, years later, that she had spent those 2 years genuinely afraid of becoming the next target if she ever stepped out of line with Brooke's particular sense of humor, and that the relief of watching someone else absorb the mockery instead of her had made it easier to laugh along than to examine what that laughter actually cost me. I appreciated her honesty about that dynamic more than I expected to, since it explained a great deal about a pattern I had never fully understood from the inside while I was living through it. If you have ever been the person a whole room quietly decided was safe to laugh at, I want you to know I understand exactly how isolating that particular kind of laughter can feel, even when nobody involved would call it cruelty out loud. Stay with me, because there is a turn coming, and if you have not already, go ahead and subscribe so you do not miss where this one lands. There was a professional cost to all of it too, one I did not fully name as bullying until much later, since it never arrived as anything you could point to directly. A project I had done most of the actual work on got presented, in a team meeting, with Brooke's name attached first and mine mentioned almost as an afterthought. A promotion I had genuinely earned went, instead, to Courtney, and when I asked my manager, carefully, why, I was told, vaguely, that fit with the team culture had been a factor in the decision, a phrase I turned over in my mind for weeks afterward, understanding, slowly, exactly what kind of fit had been missing. I did not file a formal complaint about any of it. Not the promotion, not the project credit, not the years of comments, and I have thought many times since about whether that was wisdom or simply exhaustion dressed up as patience. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage the evening I learned about the promotion, engine off, simply sitting there for nearly 20 minutes before I could bring myself to drive home, turning over every reason I could think of that might explain the decision honestly, rather than the reason I suspected was actually underneath it. I did not cry, not that particular evening, though I came closer than I let myself fully acknowledge at the time. I want to tell you honestly about the year I very nearly stopped going to church altogether, because I do not think it is fair to leave that part out. It was sometime in my second year, after a particularly hard week where Brooke had made a comment in front of a client about my church being the reason I was, in her words, a little much sometimes, and I drove to my own mother's house afterward and sat at her kitchen table and told her I was tired, clean through, of being laughed at for the one part of my life that had never once caused anyone actual harm. I remember that particular evening clearly, sitting at the same table where I had done homework as a girl, my mother's hands wrapped around a mug of tea she had made without asking whether I wanted any, simply knowing, the way mothers do, that I needed something warm to hold on to more than I needed an actual answer to any question. I told her about the client comment, about the promotion, about 3 years of small deniable cruelties that had finally accumulated into something I could no longer carry silently. My mother let me finish before she said anything, which she has always been better at than I am. Then she told me something I have never forgotten. She said, "Destiny, I am not going to tell you it is easy, and I am not going to tell you the mockery does not cost you something real, because it does. But I want you to ask yourself something before you decide anything about your own faith based on how these particular people are treating you. Are you praying in tongues because it is real to you, or because you are trying to prove something to a room that has already decided not to be impressed?" I told her it was real to me, that it always had been, since I was a girl kneeling beside her at that same altar. She said, "Then that is the only vote that actually counts here, and everything else is simply noise you are going to have to learn to carry. I did not always carry it gracefully. There were evenings I came home and cried harder than I let anyone at River of Life know, evenings I genuinely considered finding a quieter church, one where nobody at work would ever have reason to mock the way I worshipped, simply because it would have made my Monday mornings easier. I want you to know that thought crossed my mind seriously more than once, and I am not proud of how close I came to acting on it purely to make my own life at work simpler. What kept me from actually doing it in the end was something my own pastor said to me, almost offhandedly, during a conversation about something else entirely. I had gone to see him about an unrelated volunteer matter, and near the end of that conversation, almost as an afterthought, I mentioned that work had been hard lately, without going into much detail. He asked, gently, whether I wanted to talk about it, and I found myself telling him nearly the whole 3 years in the span of about 20 minutes, more than I had told almost anyone outside my own family. He told me that the specific shape of my worship was never actually the point of my faith, that I could genuinely worship quietly if I ever felt led to, but that changing my whole practice purely to avoid ridicule was a different thing altogether from growing or maturing in it, and that he did not think I actually wanted that particular reason driving a decision that large. He said, "Destiny, if the Lord ever leads you to a quieter season, that is one thing, and I would celebrate it with you. But shrinking yourself because Brooke Holloway finds you embarrassing is a decision you would be making for her, not for God, and I do not think that is a trade you actually want to make, even on the hardest Mondays." I asked him, before I left his office that afternoon, whether he thought I should say something directly to Brooke, confront her plainly the way part of me had wanted to for 2 years. He told me that confrontation was not off the table entirely, that Scripture certainly makes room for addressing wrongs directly, but that he sensed, listening to me describe her, that a direct confrontation would likely only entrench her further, and that my own particular calling in this specific situation seemed to him to be patience rather than correction. I did not fully agree with him in the moment, though I have come to believe, looking back, that he read the situation more accurately than I was capable of at the time. I sat with that for a long while and decided he was right, and kept going to River of Life exactly the way I always had, hands raised on the Sundays I felt led to raise them, quiet on the Sundays I did not, without ever once organizing my worship around what my coworkers might think of it on Monday. That decision cost me something real over the following 2 years, and I want to be honest that it did not always feel, in the moment, like the obviously correct choice it looks like now, looking back from this side of the story. Here is what those 3 years actually looked like from the inside, and I want to tell you honestly, because I do not think it is fair to make it sound tidier than it was. I never once retaliated against Brooke, Tyler, or Courtney. Not with a cutting remark, not with a complaint to human resources that I genuinely could have filed more than once, not with the quiet professional sabotage that would have been so easy to justify to myself after what they had cost me. I simply kept doing my job well, kept showing up at River of Life every single week I was able, and began, somewhere in my 2nd year, praying for all 3 of them by name most mornings before I even got out of bed, not because I felt some sudden burst of warmth toward them, but because I had been taught, my whole life, that the hardest people to pray for are usually the ones who need it most, and I decided, privately, to test whether that teaching actually held up under real pressure. There was a particular rhythm to those years that I only recognized once they were behind me. I got up most mornings a full 20 minutes earlier than I strictly needed to, simply to have that quiet stretch of prayer before the day's first meeting, a habit that had nothing dramatic about it, coffee going cold on my nightstand, a short passage read half awake, 3 names spoken aloud into an otherwise silent bedroom. Some mornings the prayer for Brooke specifically felt almost mechanical. Words I said because I had committed to saying them rather than because I felt anything particular while saying them, and I have come to believe that kind of mechanical faithfulness counts every bit as much as the mornings it flowed easily, since faith, in my experience, is rarely measured accurately by how it feels in any single moment. I did not always live up to the grace that decision asked of me. There were mornings I prayed for them through gritted teeth, mornings the prayer amounted to little more than God, help me not to hate her today, which I have come to believe counts as a real prayer even when it does not sound like one. I am not going to pretend those 3 years turned me into some tireless saint. What I can tell you is that I kept praying anyway, and kept showing up the following Monday anyway, which is a smaller, more ordinary kind of faithfulness than this story might make it sound, and which turned out to be the only kind that actually holds. There were weeks, more than I would like to admit, where the only thing carrying me back to that desk was the plain, stubborn fact that I had gone the week before, and the week before that, and stopping now would have felt like erasing every one of those quieter, harder Mondays that came before it. The ultimate audio choice for high-end podcasts and modern digital media. If you have ever had to keep showing up somewhere you were mocked, day after day, without ever fully understanding why you kept choosing to stay, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one, and I think more of us are standing in that exact kind of exhausted faithfulness than anybody around us ever realizes. It is a lonelier kind of endurance than most people talk about openly. Staying somewhere you are mocked simply because leaving would feel like handing your own faith over to the very people trying to shrink it. There was one coworker, a quiet woman named Patricia, who worked 2 desks over and had never once joined in the mockery, who became one of the gentler voices in this whole story long before anyone else was ready to hear her. She told me, privately, more than once over those years, that she found the way I kept showing up genuinely remarkable, and that she had told Brooke directly, on at least one occasion I know of, that she thought the jokes had gone further than any of them realized. Patricia told me about that particular conversation herself, months after it happened. She said she had pulled Brooke aside after a team lunch and told her, plainly, that mocking someone's faith for 2 straight years was not the kind of thing that stayed funny, simply because nobody had complained yet, and that she personally did not find any of it amusing, regardless of how the rest of the team seemed to feel about it. Brooke never fully took Patricia's warning to heart, not for years, but I noticed, looking back, that the cruelty softened slightly whenever Patricia was in the room, and I have decided that counts for something. Patricia herself came to see me privately once, near the end of my 2nd year, and told me, quietly, that she admired how I handled everything, and that she was not sure she would have managed the same grace in my position. I told her, honestly, that I did not always feel graceful, that most days it simply felt like showing up and hoping the day would end without another comment landing too hard, and she told me that sounded like exactly the right definition of grace to her, the ordinary, unglamorous kind, rather than the kind you see performed in a movie. The accident happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in the spring of my 3rd year at Heartland Mutual. Brooke's 16-year-old son, Ethan, was in a serious car accident on his way home from practice, broadsided at an intersection by a driver who ran a red light, and by the time Brooke got the call at her desk, her hands were shaking so badly she could not manage to dial her own husband's number correctly. I remember the exact quality of that Thursday afternoon. The office humming along in its usual quiet rhythm, phones ringing at other desks, nobody yet aware that anything had changed. I was reviewing a stack of claims, half listening to the ordinary background noise of the office, when I noticed Brooke's voice change, a particular sharp intake of breath, followed by a silence that did not match the easy rhythm of any normal phone call. This is the moment everything I told you about earlier finally comes back around. So stay with me. Before I show you what happened next, I want to ask you something. Has someone ever mocked the very thing about you that ended up being exactly what they needed most in their worst moment? Tell me in the comments, and hit subscribe if this story has been worth your time so far, because what happens next is the reason I am telling it at all. I was the one sitting closest to her desk that afternoon. I heard the phone call, watched her face go white, watched her hands fail at the simple task of finding her own husband's number in a contacts list she had used 1,000 times before. I did not think about 3 years of mockery in that moment. I did not think about the tambourine girl comments, or the missed promotion, or the birthday toast that had cut deeper than anyone in that room ever knew. I simply stood up, took the phone from her shaking hands, called her husband myself, and told her, plainly, that I was driving her to the hospital right now and that she was not going to argue with me about it. She did not argue. I do not think she was capable, in that moment, of anything beyond simply following whoever moved first with any certainty at all, and I happened to be that person. The drive to the hospital took 18 minutes, and I remember every single one of them clearly. Brooke silent beside me, her hands pressed flat against her own knees, and I remember praying, quietly, out loud, without deciding to, the same plain, unadorned prayers I have prayed my whole life, asking God to steady her heart and to be near her son in whatever room he was currently lying in. I did not perform it. I did not raise my voice or my hands. I simply prayed the way I pray when nobody at all is watching, because in that particular moment, I had genuinely forgotten that anyone was. I remember, too, the strange, disorienting fact of driving Brooke Holloway's own car, since mine had been parked further from the building, her hands too unsteady to manage the wheel herself, adjusting a mirror set for someone shorter than me, glancing over more than once to make sure she was still breathing steadily beside me, and thinking, somewhere around the halfway point of that drive, that 3 years of small cruelties had simply evaporated from my mind entirely, replaced by nothing more complicated than the plain, urgent fact of getting this woman to her son as quickly and safely as I possibly could. Brooke told me weeks later that she remembered every word of that prayer, that she had sat there with her eyes closed, not praying herself, simply listening, and that she could not, in that moment, find a single thing performative or strange about what she heard. Only a woman asking for help for her son, with the same plain desperation Brooke herself was too frightened to voice out loud. Ethan was in surgery for nearly 6 hours that evening, a broken femur, internal bleeding that needed to be addressed immediately, injuries serious enough that the surgeon used the word critical more than once during the family conferences in the hallway. I stayed the entire time. I did not ask permission, and I did not wait to be invited. I simply sat in that waiting room beside Brooke and her husband, brought them coffee neither of them drank, and prayed, quietly, in the corner, the same prayer language Brooke had once mocked in a break room 3 years earlier, now simply the private, unremarkable soundtrack of a woman trying to hold a family together through the worst night of their lives. I remember the particular texture of that waiting room, the same fluorescent hum I had grown so used to at the office, uncomfortable chairs, a television playing quietly in the corner that nobody was actually watching, other families scattered across the same worn furniture with their own private fears. Marcus, Brooke's husband, thanked me more than once that evening for staying, and I remember telling him, honestly, that I could not have imagined being anywhere else, which surprised me even as I said it, given everything that had passed between his wife and me over the previous 3 years. I remember, too, a particular moment around midnight that first night, sitting beside Brooke while she finally, briefly, fell asleep in an uncomfortable waiting room chair, her head against my shoulder, without either of us planning it that way, and I remember thinking, in that quiet hour, about every Monday morning I had dreaded walking into that office, and how none of those mornings had prepared me for the strange, aching tenderness of sitting there while my own tormentor slept against my shoulder, trusting me, however briefly, with something she had never once trusted me with before. I did not move for nearly an hour, not wanting to wake her, watching the same television nobody was watching, listening to the quiet machinery of a hospital at night, and praying, silently now, that whatever came next for her son would be gentle enough for this particular fragile trust between us to actually survive it. Tyler and Courtney came by the hospital the following morning, having heard what happened, and found me still there, having gone home only briefly to shower and change before returning. Tyler told me later that seeing me in that waiting room, 3 days running, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, was the single most confusing thing he had witnessed in his entire adult life, because it did not match a single joke he had ever told at my expense. He asked me, standing awkwardly near the vending machines that first morning, why I was still there, given everything, and I told him, honestly, that Brooke needed someone, and that I happened to be someone who was able to stay. Ethan came out of surgery successfully, though the recovery ahead of him was going to be long, and it was on the third day, once the immediate danger had passed, that Brooke finally said something to me in that hospital hallway that I have turned over in my mind more times than almost anything else in this whole story. She said, "Destiny, I have made fun of you for 3 years, and you have not left my side for 3 days, and I do not understand how those two things can both be true about the same relationship, and I need you to help me understand it, because I do not think I have ever actually witnessed anything like it before in my whole life." I remember exactly where we were standing when she said it, just outside Ethan's recovery room, her eyes swollen from 3 days of crying, her voice barely above a whisper, and I remember feeling, in that moment, not vindication, which surprised me, but something closer to relief. The particular relief of watching a wall you have carried for years begin, finally, to actually move under its own weight, rather than any effort of mine to push it. I told her honestly that I had spent 3 years praying for her by name, not because I had stopped being hurt by the mockery, but because I had decided, a long time ago, that the hurt did not get to decide who I was going to be, and that watching her son fight for his life had simply given me the chance to finally show her what all that praying had actually been building toward the whole time. She did not say much else that day. She simply hugged me, longer and tighter than she ever had in 3 years of working beside me, and I understood, watching her face, that something in her had finally cracked open. Marcus told me himself, some weeks later, that he had known for years about the way his wife talked about me at home, the jokes she brought back from the office, and that he had never once thought much of it, assuming it was simply ordinary workplace ribbing, rather than anything that actually cost someone real pain. He told me watching me in that waiting room had changed his own understanding of his wife's stories retroactively, forcing him to reconsider 3 years of secondhand anecdotes he had laughed along with without ever once questioning them. It was nearly a month later, once Ethan was home and steadily recovering, that Brooke asked if she could come to church with me one Sunday, just to see it for herself, honestly, without deciding in advance what she would find. I remember driving her there myself that first Sunday morning, both of us quiet in the car, and I remember her asking, nervously, right before we walked in, whether people would notice she was new, and me telling her that at River of Life, being new usually meant getting hugged by at least 6 different women before the service even started, which turned out to be, if anything, an understatement. She sat in the back row that first Sunday, tense, watching the worship the way you watch something you have spent years assuming you already understood well enough to mock. During the second song, when the whole room lifted together, hands raised, voices rising, I watched her close her eyes, and I watched tears start down her face that she did not bother wiping away. Afterward, in the parking lot, she told me she had spent the entire service waiting to feel the impulse to laugh, the same impulse that had fueled 3 years of jokes at my expense, and that it had never once arrived, replaced instead by something she did not yet have words for. She told me, too, that she had spent most of the drive over rehearsing an exit strategy, a reason she could give for leaving early if the service made her uncomfortable, and that she had never once needed to use it. She came back the following week, and the week after that. It was nearly 2 months before she asked, quietly, after a service, whether someone could explain to her what it actually meant to pray in the language she had once imitated so cruelly in a break room, and I sat with her for over an hour that afternoon, answering every question honestly, the same patient way my own mother had once explained it to curious visitors at River of Life, for as long as I could remember. She asked whether it was something she could learn to do herself, or whether it was something that simply happened to certain people, and I told her honestly that in my own understanding, it was a gift freely given rather than a skill acquired, but that the posture of asking for it, openly and sincerely, was itself the only real prerequisite anyone had ever taught me. I remember that particular conversation clearly, the two of us sitting in the empty sanctuary after everyone else had left, Brooke asking question after question with a genuine hunger I had never once seen from her in 3 years of working beside her. She apologized to me again, unprompted, partway through that conversation, this time specifically for the break room performance, telling me she had thought of it more times over the preceding months than she could count, and that she now understood she had been mocking something she had never once actually taken the time to ask a single honest question about. Tyler came the following spring, invited not by me but by Brooke herself, who told him, plainly, that he owed it to himself to actually witness the thing he had spent years joking about without ever once attending. He came skeptical, stayed for the message, and told me afterward that he had never once heard anyone preach about grace the way our pastor preached about it that particular Sunday, gently, without a single mention of the specific mockery he himself had participated in, though he told me later he had felt it land squarely on him anyway. Tyler's own journey took longer than Brooke's, nearly a full year of attending on and off, asking careful, skeptical questions after almost every service, and I remember him telling me, partway through that year, that the hardest part for him was not believing the theology, which he found, to his own surprise, more coherent than he expected, but forgiving himself for 3 years of jokes he now understood had actually wounded someone rather than simply entertained a room. I told him that forgiveness was, in my experience, exactly the kind of thing our faith was built to offer, and that he did not need to earn his way into it through some extended penance before he was welcome at the altar rail. Tyler asked me once, during that year of questions, whether I had ever genuinely hated him, even briefly, during the worst of the mockery. I told him honestly that there had been mornings I came close, mornings the prayer I said for him felt more like an obligation than an actual desire for his good, but that I had never once let those mornings become the whole truth of how I felt about him, because I did not believe hatred, even the brief kind, was a place I wanted to build a permanent home. Tyler was baptized this past fall and asked me, of everyone at the church, to stand with him at the front during the service, telling me he could not imagine anyone else being there for that particular moment, given everything I had actually witnessed of his own journey to it. Courtney took the longest of the three, nearly a year and a half after Brooke's first visit, and when she finally came, she told me she had needed to watch both Brooke and Tyler change, slowly, over real time, before she could trust that whatever was happening at River of Life was genuine, rather than some passing emotional reaction to a frightening week in a hospital. She told me, the day she finally attended her first service, that she had spent 18 months watching Brooke's meal ministry work and Tyler's genuine, sustained change in how he treated everyone at the office, not just me, and that only after that much sustained evidence had she felt ready to actually walk through the doors herself. I want to be honest that Courtney's caution never once bothered me, because I recognized in it something I respected rather than something I needed to hurry along. She had watched two people change under real pressure and had decided, wisely I think, that a year and a half of consistent evidence mattered more to her than any single emotional Sunday morning could have. She still comes most weeks now, still working through her own questions at her own pace, and she has told me more than once that she appreciates, more than she can fully express, that I never once pushed her to move faster than she was ready to. Here is where everyone stands now. Brooke has been coming to River of Life for over 2 years, and she leads a portion of the church's meal ministry now, coordinating support for families going through medical crises, a role she told me she chose specifically because she remembers, more clearly than almost anything else in her life, exactly what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that kind of care when she had done nothing at all to earn it. She told me not long ago that she keeps a small notebook now with the names of everyone she has ever heard mock someone else's faith at Heartland Mutual, not to shame them, she said, but simply as a private prayer list, the same way I once kept her name on my own, and that she has decided the whole 3 years of mockery only makes sense to her now as the slowest, strangest answer to a prayer she never once knew I was praying on her behalf. Patricia still works at Heartland Mutual, and she told me recently that she has started, quietly, mentioning River of Life to a few other coworkers who have expressed their own curiosity since watching Brooke, Tyler, and Courtney change so visibly over these past few years, and that she considers herself, in her own words, the gentle usher who simply kept the door propped open long enough for the rest of them to eventually notice it. She told me, too, that she has started praying now herself, something she had not done consistently in years before she watched this whole story unfold from her desk 2 seats over, and that she credits watching me, more than any sermon she has ever heard, with reminding her what an ordinary, unglamorous faith actually looks like when it is tested by something real rather than simply discussed in the abstract. Ethan, Brooke's son, fully recovered within the year, walks without any lasting difficulty, and he came to church with his mother for the first time this past Easter, sitting quietly beside her, and Brooke cried through nearly the entire service, the same way she had that very first Sunday, though she tells me now it is an entirely different kind of crying. Ethan himself told me, that same Easter afternoon, that his mother had told him the whole story, all 3 years of it, sometime during his recovery, and that he had found it strange, at 16, to learn that his own accident had somehow become the hinge on which an entire friendship, and eventually 3 separate conversions, had turned. He asked me, a little shyly, whether I had really prayed over him in that hospital room the whole night, and I told him yes, and he told me he was glad, because he had woken up once, briefly, during that long first night, and had heard, faintly, through the fog of medication, a voice praying somewhere nearby, and had always wondered, since then, whether he had imagined it. I want to leave you with what I have come to believe was the actual center of this whole story. If you are somewhere in the middle of your own version of it right now, mocked for the exact shape of your own faith by people you have to sit beside every single day, you cannot argue your way past someone's ridicule, and you cannot force a crisis to arrive on a convenient schedule to prove your patience was worth something. What you can do, the only thing I ever actually did across 3 years, was keep living the plain, ordinary shape of your own faith in front of the people mocking you, without resentment, without demanding they see you sooner than they were able to. I did not know, for 3 years, whether Brooke, Tyler, or Courtney would ever actually see me clearly. I only knew that I still intended to be exactly who I already was, whether they were watching closely enough to notice or not, and it turned out, in the end, that was the only argument that was ever actually going to reach them. I think often about how close this story came to never reaching this particular ending. If I had left that job during my 2nd year, the way some part of me genuinely wanted to more than once, I would never have been sitting at that desk the exact afternoon Brooke's phone rang. I do not say that to suggest the outcome was owed to me, because it was not, and Ethan's accident was a real and frightening thing that cost this family something none of us would ever wish for. I say it only because I think it is worth being honest that some walls do not come down through patience alone. Sometimes they require a crisis neither side would ever have chosen, arriving at exactly the moment it was needed, whether either of us was ready for it or not. I have wondered, more than once since, what might have happened if I had simply called in sick that particular Thursday, or requested a desk transfer months earlier the way I had once seriously considered doing after a particularly hard week. I do not have an answer for that. I only know I did not do either of those things, and that whatever ordinary stubbornness kept me sitting at that desk turned out to matter more than I could have possibly understood at the time. I have come to believe that the 3 years of mockery were never actually wasted, even though they felt, at the time, like a slow, ongoing loss with no end in sight. Every quiet morning prayer said through gritted teeth, every Monday I chose to show up anyway. Every Sunday I kept my hands raised regardless of what I knew Tuesday's break room conversation would sound like, was its own small act of faithfulness, building, without my fully realizing it, toward a moment none of us could have predicted or planned for. Faithfulness rarely announces which particular ordinary Thursday it is actually preparing you for. It simply asks you to keep showing up, one hard Monday at a time, until the day finally arrives that needs exactly the person you have quietly been all along, whether anyone around you has noticed that particular person forming or not. I think, too, about the woman I became across those 3 years, and I do not say this with any pride, only with a kind of quiet astonishment when I look back at who I was that first month at Heartland Mutual, still certain, in the naive way you are certain at 23, that a simple, honest explanation would settle any confusion about my faith once and for all. It did not settle anything, not for a long while, and I had to learn a harder, slower patience than I ever expected an ordinary office job would ask of me. The kind that does not announce itself as growth while it is happening, and only reveals its shape much later, in a hospital hallway, watching someone finally see what 3 years of jokes had never once let them notice. I do not think I could have explained that particular kind of patience to my 23-year-old self, even if I had tried. Some things simply have to be lived through slowly, one hard Monday at a time, before they can be understood at all, and I have come to believe that is exactly as it should be, since a patience learned too easily rarely holds up under the specific weight that actually tests it. That is my story. 3 years, one accident, one hospital hallway, and a wall that came down not because I argued it down, but because I simply never stopped being someone worth watching closely when it actually mattered. Destiny. My own mother told me not long ago, using my full name the way she only does when something matters to her. I do not think you ever once set out to change anyone at that office. I think you simply refused to let them change you first. And it turns out that refusal was its own kind of quiet miracle, working itself out over 3 years none of us could have rushed even if we had tried. I think, in the end, about that small tambourine I asked you to remember at the very start of this story, the one that sat in my desk drawer my entire first day at Heartland Mutual. A quiet reminder of home that never once left that drawer in 3 years, since I never brought it to work and never once needed to. Brooke asked me, not long ago, whether I still had it, and when I told her yes, she asked if she could see it, and I brought it in the following Monday, and she held it for a long moment, turning it over in her hands, and told me she wished, more than almost anything else, that she could go back and simply ask me about it honestly, on some ordinary Tuesday morning 3 years earlier, instead of turning it into the punchline of a joke she never once bothered to actually understand. I do not think either of us could have written that particular image in advance. Brooke Holloway holding my grandmother's tambourine at her own desk, turning it over gently in her hands, the exact same way she once mocked the idea of it existing at all. I have decided it is the truest picture I know of how this whole story actually ended, not with an argument won or a joke finally silenced, but with the very thing once mocked simply being held, carefully, by the same hands that had once made fun of it. I still work at Heartland Mutual, 3 years and one hospital hallway later, sitting at the same desk in the same beige cubicle, though the office itself feels entirely different to me now than it did that first anxious month. I do not know whether I would have believed you, back during my 2nd year, if you had told me the woman leading my mockery would one day be leading a meal ministry at my own church, weeping through worship songs with her hands raised beside mine. I am glad, now, that faith does not require us to believe the specific shape an ending will take, only that an ending worth waiting for is actually possible, even on the days it feels the furthest away. If you have ever been mocked for the way you worship, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments, because I believe there are far more of us than anybody around us realizes. And if this one meant something to you, share it with somebody who needs to hear that quiet faithfulness, under real pressure, is still doing more work than it feels like most days. And if you have not subscribed yet, I would love to have you here for the next one.